Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jim Tyrrell. Thank you so much for joining me at what is early my time here in Boulder, Colorado, USA. This talk is 10 more design tips for microservices developers. And since this is a Java talk, towards the end of this, I'm going to layer in 10 tips for Java microservices developers. As I mentioned, my name is Jim Tyrrell. On the socials, you can find me as the Designatic. And I'm all about helping people create minimum lovable products. And I've always thought at conferences, we should share these presentations. So in the chat, I did share what I hope is an open link to this talk. So with that, let's get started on this, and always got to get your focus on the right screen. So how are we here and how am I here with this, right? Going back 5 or 6 years ago, I read this amazing book, which came out probably 15 or 16 years ago. The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. Absolutely amazing book from Alan Cooper. Alan Cooper founded and created a lot of stuff that we now take for granted around VB and .NET and the developer tooling that was in that space. And his thought around design is really you should outsource it to designers with a capital D and maybe a lowercase d. And, that was a prescription I subscribed to for quite a while, but it just didn't quite jive with me until 2 summers ago or so. I read this book by Clive Thompson, who's an absolutely fantastic writer, writes for Wired magazine, wrote this book, Coders. And halfway through that book, Coders, it hit me, you know what? Software developers are making tons of decisions that I would label design decisions. We'll get to that in a second. And when you put these two books together with the pandemic, I decided to create a community, which I'll share with a link for you here in a little bit, called Design for Developers. And I'd start encoding some of these things that I've been thinking about as design in the context of software, especially with both my CS degree and my design degree. And one of the questions I ask in talks like this is, where does user interfaces, user experiences, and customer experience in the context of software development land? And really the question is, what kind of user interfaces are there in software? And obviously a GUI, right? A graphical user interface is a user interface, but did you know the code you write is also a user interface? And more importantly for this talk, an API as a service is a user interface, right? So these RESTful endpoints with the words we use in them, the vernacular and the submission of packets and of information we're passing in there, JSON objects, et cetera, and the things we respond are all most certainly a user interface. When I've done this talk in the past, people chime in with things like test cases, documentation, and other things. And, those certainly are impacts on the user interface, but for the purpose of coders, what we like to do day in and day out, what we create, we are certainly creating graphical user interfaces, software code, and services every single day. So let's think a little bit more about that. If you go to the Wikipedia definition, I think it would back up that all three of these are user interfaces. One of the things that gets me out of bed every single day as a software developer is the fact that software development is science, art, patterns, and methods, right? That's the best part about this, right? This software game is a science, but it has a lot of creativity in it. And it has a lot of those things that we call patterns and methods in it. Looking at my design degree, change the order slightly. Obviously the world probably calls design as art, but the design school I went to would probably put science first. And it also has patterns and methods. And it's actually a skill that can be learned and can give up its secrets, as one of my favorite mentors talks about. And you know what, as a son of a math teacher, when you put those two things together, you know what, software development is design and design is software development via the transitive property. These are things that are inescapable from each other. While you are writing software, you cannot escape them no matter what it is you do. A little bit more about myself. I've got a bachelor's degree in computer science, been a Java guy for 25 plus years now. I definitely find my people with this talk. I've spent a decade or so at the beginning of my career doing software development, 15 years as a technical seller here at Red Hat. Finishing up about 5 years ago, I got a master's of design methods degree from the hardest design school on the planet, master's only education at the Institute of Design in Chicago. I went there every other weekend for 2 years. And I have thought a lifetime about what it means to be a human in the context and how we intersect with software. And this is my favorite quote that I put out there. Everything created by humans is designed. Software as a subset of everything is therefore always designed. Every decision you make probably has some sort of impact on a human. Certainly impacts you while you're developing it. It certainly will impact your teams while it is being developed, and it will certainly impact users down the way in the schedule of things that are delivered around software. So in the lead up to this talk, I talked about one thing that I promised you was the 5 E's. The 5 E's, if you're not familiar with it, comes from 1997, right? 24 years old. At this point, it was delivered at what became the TED Talks, if you're familiar with those. And for the middle 3 of the 5 E's, I crossed out great and I crossed out the word curated. And I would say every experience has 3 organic states. In other words, every state or every experience you go into will have these 3 states, right? You will have the enter state, the engaged state, and the exit state organically. These are just going to happen no matter what you do. You as a human interacting with the world, whether you're going to a football game, either American or European, whether you're going to a movie, watching TV, making dinner, all these experiences will have those 3 states with them. But if you are designing great curated experiences, there's 2 more that I challenge you to add to your experience, right? One of those would be, how do you bring people into the experience? How do you let them know that they are coming into this thing? You know, how are you going to entice them to this particular experience? And then at the end, after it's over for them, what are you going to do to extend that experience for them? What are you going to do to manifest your brand? Let them know that you care about them as a user. What are you going to do to make them better than they ever could be with just those 3 states in the middle? I think we as software developers don't do a great job of thinking about how we're going to bring people into an activity and how we're going to extend that for them. If you notice on these slides in the bottom middle, I have the word entice on this one. You know what? We're in the entice part of our talk. I'm still trying to bring you along with a narrative and a story that I'm bringing along. More importantly, along the way, if you have any questions, I've got headphones in. Feel free to just come off mute, interrupt, and ask questions along the way. We'll certainly leave some time at the end for questions as we're working our way through this. But again, I would challenge you that every great experience has these 5 curated states. Think about enticing your user into the experience, get them thinking about what it means to enter across that border to come into it. What does it mean, obviously, to engage with it? How do you let them know that they're exiting? And then what can you do to extend that? Going back again, almost 23 years or so, Nelson Norman Group, a great user interface design consultancy out of California here in the United States, has this great list. But sadly, it just spoke to designers to me that are working in the arts. It just didn't really speak to me as a software developer. So I did what every good enterprising software developer would do. I created my own list. And so let's cross the border, if you will. Let's enter this talk. 10 more design tips for microservices developers. And then we'll give you also 10 tips for Java microservices developers. We're going to go through each of these 10 in depth here, but they're just here for your reference if you want to look at them. With that, let's get going. So number 1 on my list is doc debris. As you're bringing users into your experience, you want to avoid these 4 things, right? Anti-quick starts, the wall of intertwined text, missing steps, and the dreaded back and forth. Let's define those. So the anti-quick starts, you know, I'm still amazed today. And what is this, 2021 in October? My birthday's in a few days. I still click on links that say they're a quick start with anything more than 3 or 4 things that you want me to do. You know what? That's not a quick start. If you have tens or even hundreds of steps, you do not have a quick start. Please label it something else. And if you want to have a quick start, you know, my challenge to you would be, you know, 1 to 3 items tops. The next one is the wall of intertwined text, right? In this multi-operating system world that we hang out in, Windows, Linux, Mac desktops are certainly everywhere. This wall of intertwined text will have start, you know, step 1, it'll clearly denote Windows, Linux, and Mac instructions. Then you'll move on to step 2, and the order of instructions might be changed. You might not have the Mac instructions, and finally get to step 3 where there's only the Mac instructions. And you know what? These steps are never labeled 1, 2, 3. They're just this long, winding road of text that you're supposed to parse an end user to figure out how to get started with this project. And you know what? As I look at GitHub projects, as I look at lots of getting started materials over the years, lots of projects violate this rule. Please, pretty please, do not expect your users to deal with the wall of intertwined text. And you know what? We got a cut and paste thing here with that. So missing steps. This is one of my favorite ones that's along the way that's out there, right? Download the software, install it with these commands, run it, and then you see an error, right? If you do not have complete instructions around what it is that you're asking your end user to do or use, how do you expect them to get started? How do you expect them to get going with this? And let me fill in that 4th one that I miss, which is the back and forth, right? Sadly, I don't have that one written up here. But the back and forth is this idea that I'm going to grab various piece parts from documentation that you might provide. Then I'm going to have my own notes in my notebook or a notepad or whatever it is I'm doing to gather my information. Then sadly, I've got to go to Stack Overflow and figure out what it is I might have missed. And I've got to put all those things together as a flow to figure out how to get something done within your product or offering and to get started with it. That idea of back and forth just drives me absolutely bonkers. It is the state of our world is in our industry. And please, pretty please, do not do that to our end users. The next one is you're bringing people into your offering is you want to figure out and let them know what you're doing to secure their data, secure the interaction with them, whether that's, obviously using TLS or HTTPS and certs, dealing with tokens and keys, dealing with passwords and or how they expire, what kind of timeouts they have, certainly data at rest. In the world I hang out in the US federal government, the FIP standards of 140-2 or -3. What do you do around resetting passwords? And, my biggest ask around tokens and keys, if users are required to use tokens and keys and or how are they stored? How are they end of life? And if you don't tell users what's going on there, you could drive them a little bit crazy. For an A-formed unnamed vendor, a couple months back, I grabbed a few tokens from them. I didn't use them for a month, tried to run them again a month later. The example from cutting and pasting from their website examples didn't work. I thought to myself, well, surely that certainly should work. Re-downloaded the tokens and keys. You know what? I assumed that they expired, but didn't tell me that. Didn't let me know that they were invalid in the UI. And I had to guess and figure that out on my own, right? Friction, toil, and visible work for your end users drives them insane. Putting yourself in the shoes of those end users will make you a much better software developer, but will also make your users a lot happier. In this day and age, right? We are at internet scale, mobile apps, TikTok videos, Slashdot from back in the day, news articles, all these things can bring a ton of users to your systems. What are you going to do to stand up and not break, but bend ever so slightly against these end users, right? And these are things you want to be thinking about, right? Disaster recovery, highly available infrastructure, certain things that are horizontally scalable as you see fit, right? Our world of Kubernetes, Knative, serverless, functions as a service all help us with this. And of course, thinking about the saga pattern, idempotency, and just dealing with that is a important thing for us to think about in this world. Support over stumbling, right? When you're bringing that user into, now we're crossing that interstate of the 5 E's, right? We're bringing our user into our offering. What are we doing to make sure that they can be successful right out of the gate? How are we making it easy for them to get started? Who is that end user that you are targeting? We'll get to a little bit more depth here of that in just a second. How can you give them self-service and not necessarily need a credit card or other things to get access to your service? What can you do to just empower them to get going as quickly as possible to let them know what it is that they need to do to be successful with that microservice that you're delivering? Let's look at a real example here. This is from our friends at Twilio. I was doing a POC, a proof of concept, a couple of weeks back, and I downloaded their getting started example. Pretty simple here, 2 phone numbers and a text message. I went through their UI, pretty easy. They curated me through that, allowed me to put in my phone number, allowed me to get a phone number for them to receive a text message at, put some code together, updated this code to be my phone number. And you know what? Lo and behold, I could not send a text message. And I said to myself, well, that's kind of crazy. I mean, a text message would be from the number because your phone would be first, right? Then the to phone number would be second. And then the text message you're sending would be third. Oh no, they switched the order on me. The phone number for 2 was actually first. The from number was in the second position, and then the string body was in the third position. Completely orthogonal to my mental model of the world, the way I feel like texting has worked since the first phone that I got that could do text messaging, right? Upending the end user's world, not mapping to that physical world, using a little bit of what we call in the design field skeuomorphism can drive your end users just a little bit crazy and batty. One of the things that drives me absolutely insane, my biggest pet peeve in the world is the word ID. We'll talk about that in just a second. But I label this one standardization over straying. And if you look at this Swagger screenshots of just the Spring Pet Store application, in the upper left-hand corner, you have the ability to post a pet and update a pet. I'm a little bit frustrated slightly that I really think it should look more like this, and that the putting or updating of a pet would actually have the pet ID on the URL. the semantics of updating that URL and or updating that pet object, to me, works a lot better with finding pets, updating a pet image, being able to delete a pet and or do other activities with that. I really think that that empty URL really makes a lot more sense to me on the left-hand side than it does on the right-hand side. But let's dive into that ID notion. And should it be ID all caps or capital I, lowercase d, as this documentation sort of is. But if you look at this here, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you look at this blue get pet ID, you can see find pet by ID, and they've capitalized it. All these script-like things are a capital I, lowercase d. And of course, you go look at the examples of this, you look at some of the XML markup and you get lowercase ID, you get a capital I, lowercase d, pet ID, ID of pet return, it's capitalized. My rule that I've put out there in the world, although even the Java APIs don't do this, I was looking at, I forget what API I was looking at recently, but they had a lowercase d. My friendly suggestion for your sanity, for your teams, is to always be ID, always capped in every place, wherever it is. I would also argue, especially for us as Java programmers, fully qualifying which ID you're going to use is probably important. Again, looking at this pet store example, which ID is it, right? The first ID is a pet. The second ID, I assume, is a category. The third ID is around tags. And you know what? I am of the opinion that should be pet ID, category ID, and tag ID, all caps for the ID, just so that when you are putting in strings in your code, when you're trying to debug things, deal with challenges and problems, you've actually got a fighting chance to at least have the right ID passed around. I prefer not to raise my hand, but I more than a few times have done that to myself when I first started out in Java development. And that most certainly drove me just a little bit crazy along the way. So sensing over summoning, right? This is this idea that without necessarily needing highly trained users, can they guess or figure out what is it they should do next, right? If you think about the first iPhone or iPad, when that landed in the world, people took those devices to sub-Saharan Africa, and people that had never really even seen a computer were able to use them to figure them out. That's the kind of thing that I'm speaking to here. The question I always ask software developers is, are your developers like airplane pilots or nuclear power plant operators? Are they trained to deal with an eventual possible outcome that may never happen? Think about that, right? Think about how highly skilled and trained pilots and nuclear power plant operators are. They drill incessantly around things that probably will never happen to them. They have extensive checklists to deal with any issues when they do come up. And I would argue that most of our users are just like this guy, Homer Simpson, right? Trying to figure out, try to survive the day in and day out activities of life, trying to get something done for this week, this month, this quarter, maybe once a year with whatever it is you're delivering for them. The other thing that I ask and think about with software developers is actually you all as software developers are not airplane pilots or nuclear power plant operators. You're actually the people that could train those people and have an expertise that is in far excess of your average user. Of course, this begets the question, what happens when Homer Simpson is your nuclear power plant operator? Luckily, that's a cartoon character. We don't have to worry about that too much today. The next one I want to talk about is safety over setback. This idea that we want to allow people an emergency release button, being able to go with a back button or undo. I'm amazed today. I forgot what I was touching just a couple of days ago, but I could not use the back button in a relatively new app that had been delivered. Definitely thinking about eventual consistency. That idea of item potency in the Saga pattern probably fits into this again. How do you deal with thread safety, right? As Java developers, that's most certainly something we need to think about with our applications. But what are we doing to prevent and or let our users know that we've thought about those type of challenges along the way? Another couple things to think about here, right? Error messages in Java, you know, the dreaded null pointer exception. If you didn't see it with JDK 17, they now tell you which object is null. From a human user perspective and doing some code lately, I was wondering if that was ever going to get fixed. That was absolutely awesome. But I really think error messages should give next corrective steps. They really should let you know what's going on there. If you're passing in values, you really should let your end users know what didn't pass or isn't validated. If your JSON RESTful object wants the letters first name all spelled out with a capital N, and that field is not filled in yet, it's required, you probably should throw them a error that did not get mapped. I get that that's probably a feature request for the Jackson libraries and a few other places, but that to me just drives me batty crazy is people put in a colon in the wrong place and Postman, or do any number of things just trying to get the case right of your JSON objects as they're going to and fro. And the biggest one that drives me absolutely insane in this list, a white screen of death is never okay. If I hit a web browser endpoint to your RESTful API and an error occurs, please, pretty please give me something more than a white screen of death. And keep in mind that more than likely your end users do not have access to the terminal to figure out what's going wrong with your web service that you're delivering for them. Stewardship over suffering, right? For the long-term use of your product, what are you doing to give them real world examples, documentation, and things that are available to them as users, right? Often we ship hello world examples. Often we ship every nerd knob documented, but where's the middle ground? Where's the middle typical use cases that your users are going to do with your API? What are you going to do to document that typical use case? A complete curation for them, if you will, another framework I have maybe for another day. And then what are you going to do to get out in the world and observe your users and remove that friction, toil, and invisible work from their work, right? This friction, toil, and invisible work is a great thing to put in the back of your mind. As you're designing things, as you're thinking about how they are used, removing that will do just tons of things for your end users. Status over surmising, as your end user is getting out of your experience, what are you doing to end that for them, to delineate that the experience is over? What are you doing to log that experience for them? What are you doing to give them metrics or stats about what it is that they did along the way? What are you doing to clearly let them know that they did great and they did an amazing job with whatever it is you were asking them to do? These are all things that can make that experience better for them as an end user. And then statistics and study over speculation, right? This idea of extending the experience for the end user, right? This is the one that I challenge you as a software developer to really think about. What are you doing to let them know about the success with your offering? Did they do more things than the average user? Did they compute, more terms? Did they do things faster than others? There's all kinds of things you could do to extend that experience for them, to let them know that you appreciated what it is that they did with you and the time they spent and dedicated to your offering. The other thing to think a little bit about is the idea of getting user interviews and surveys, right? Asking them for what they thought about what that experience was for you and for them. What did they gain from it? What did they learn? How did they feel along the way? Asking for that emotional state will do wonders for giving you insight as to the state of the mind of your end users. And with this one, a story about a nameless vendor. Probably 9 months ago, I was snowboarding with a friend of mine. He told me about a new cloud database service he was using. He was in their alpha or beta program, was having some problems. The product manager noticed that he was using the API. It looked like he had been stuck because of the telemetry that they had inserted into the product in the background. This vendor reached out to my friend and said, "Hey, we see you're having some challenges or problems. Would you like to meet?" Set up a calendar time. And you know what? That product manager brought a program manager and a developer together to have my friend show them via Zoom what was going wrong with the API and the challenges he was having. And you know what? That meeting was on a Monday or Tuesday. And by Thursday or Friday that week, most of the errors and issues and challenges, the friction, toil, and invisible work that my friend had uncovered were removed from the product. Think about that turnaround. Think about that feedback you're giving to the end users. Think about what it is that you are giving to that experience, to that user, and how much love and care and affection they are feeling from you as a vendor or as a creator of software in that experience. So with that, let's move on to the 10 Java microservice developer tips, since we are here at a Java conference. And let's riff, if you will, on the first one, right? We had doc debris, the last one. The next one I'm going to speak to is doc weeds, or documentation weeds, right? This comes from a talk I had a couple weeks ago with an acquaintance of mine, and they were just amazed at how easy it was for them to Google for certain results around a specific, fairly widely used Java framework. I'll let you decide which one on your own. But the search results could get you down in the weeds of version numbers, and that you might end up on, say version 3 or 4, and the current version is 6 or 7. They found that was just really a big headache. Another one that I kind of put in this vein, if you will, is documentation that has been copied all over the web. Those things are out and about all over. It's a little bit of the first one, if you will, but it could really lead to some challenges in that your end users don't exactly know who to trust or where to go. And then my favorite one is that the internet has done this copying of your documentation, but you know what? What they've documented, is fundamentally wrong and incorrect. If you do not go out of your way in your own offering to document the right way to use these libraries, I don't have enough psychology background, but that feels very wrong to me as a end user consumer of software. So please, as you're thinking about how your software is documented, think about the doc weeds and how they grow across the internet. Another one that I would think about in Java land that we've been doing forever are these package names, right? And these, of course, correlate to file folders, right? And, we have things like model, data, content, logging, any number of package names may exist in them. And you know what? These packages may have hundreds of files in them. And even worse, these hundreds of files might all have the same name if you didn't do a great job of renaming them, right? So you might have user Java in all these different buckets, right? Model, data, content, logging, mapping, etc. And I've seen it. I've heard people talk about it, that sometimes people spend 5 minutes scrolling up and down in a file folder, trying to find that one file they're looking for to go look at it to figure out what's going on. And I would argue and challenge that we really should think about a slightly different packaging structure. And what I have been thinking a lot about and talking to a lot of my peers is using a notion of domain-driven development to create that domain bucket, right? To use things like user registration or settings, these top-level, high-level things that you care about. I've gotten in the habit of capitalizing them just so they stand out a little bit better to me in the IDE as I'm looking at them. And what this really does is it allows you to segment a much smaller group of files that work together to solve a particular microservices problem, and allows you or really prevents you from having to scroll all the way up and down throughout your offering or your APIs and your file systems, right? Giving you a much more or a lot less to look at. As we take this one step further within that user package, do we do something like this, which is API user, model user, persistence user, and service user? That service user probably shouldn't be underlined under user, but this idea of APIs, models, persistence, and services could greatly simplify the naming conventions that we're going to use. So we don't really have to burn any brain cells thinking about that. But we also can conceptualize and encapsulate the idea that an API star.java is everything around dealing with RESTful endpoints and dealing with all the annotations and things that are around that. Our idea of model is the JSON RESTful objects that's going to be passed in and out of that API, right? So that model and API are somewhat tightly bound together, at least in principle. At the bottom part of this, the service user is the heavy lifting, and most of these cases would have top level actions like add a user, delete a user, etc. But then that wires into the persistence user, in this case, .java file, which is something dealing with all your entities or JPA annotations. We also might have class names around client, RESTful invocations. Really, it comes down to just thinking about how you can have a standard across your project, have consistency in your naming across all these various packages that you're going to create. Think about domain-driven development. Think about the smallest correct unit of things that come together to make your life a lot easier as a Java developer, so you're not perpetually scrolling hundreds of files as you're thinking about this. Longer term, these packages can then help you deal with deploying these things as standalone individual deployable units as you think about this. So, and I've got a typo in there. Yeah, that happens. That's what I get. Persistence user. Thanks for that. What of the persistence user? Yeah, just a little bit of a typo there. So another one I was thinking about in this is the idea of our modifiers for our objects and our methods, right? So in this one, again, after talking about and thinking about this, especially for our models and persistence objects, which are basically just holders, if you will, for values, like in this one, first name, you'll notice that string first name has no modifier on it. I'm using the empty modifier, or some people call it the public private modifier on this. This basically means that first name is only accessible to other classes within that same package. Very, very powerful as a thought. Definitely it helps the compiler, will help you manage where you have cross-cutting concerns. If you create public getters and setters all over the place, what I have found is that you get a huge mismatch spider web of cross-cutting interdependencies that make it such that you cannot take things apart for microservices deployment. This really helps you as a developer, as a microservices developer, to really keep things consistent, if you will, around this. And I would actually say one level further, you could actually take your class and make that be unmodified also, so that it is only at the package level that it is available to your other objects. Very, very powerful as a thought. I've been doing this quite a bit lately, some fun projects I've been doing on the side. And this has really allowed me to really keep things tightly packaged, encapsulated at the package level, and really sets me up to allow my services to be deployed as microservices. Another one that I think that's very important, if you have an object, and I'm going to say this kind of globally, if you have any sort of object holding state and you do not have a toString method on that, I really think you're doing yourself and or your end users a disservice, at least when you're doing development. Allowing people to quickly and easily decode and dereference all those values that have been set within that is just something that's very, 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 very powerful within this. And I'm amazed with how many libraries I touch that don't have toString methods when I'm just trying to learn what's going on, trying to learn the syntax, trying to figure out if everything's set correctly. You know, is there a bug in the API? Is there a bug in my use of it? Not having that, to me, just kind of defeats the purpose of some of the power of the Java encapsulation that we've had for the 20+ years of software development. Another one that I like to think about is telemetry and monitoring, and I got a thumbs up. Hopefully that's around toString. So a friend of mine who likes to see toString out there. So thank you, Joseph. So telemetry and monitoring, right? You know, we have things like micrometer that allow us to see if we can find long running, you know, the easy one is SQL statements. But I also think you want to think a little bit about how things are rendering for end users from the web front end or Postman, right? If that doesn't really have a lot of timing in that, but you want to think about what are your users really doing under the covers? Going back to that example of my friend and a web database company's software as a service, being able to log and see what your end users are doing and not just guessing what it is that they're doing, and actually making improvements to things they're really doing in your software offerings is just so powerful. And this is where you can make a lot of impact. If you are improving things that nobody touches, what are you really improving? Right? If you're improving things that people use day in and day out, people are struggling with day in and day out, that can drastically change the game in the ways in which your end users are feeling about the APIs or the software services that you are delivering. Test cases, you know, this is one that I think the world of Java developers, you know, I still struggle with this one. I still struggle with creating enough test cases around what it is I'm delivering. But going back to the naming convention of things in my package, if I have something like API domain, test cases around that API domain should by consequence test the model objects that were created for me. By the same token, if I test and exercise that service domain Java file, that should as a consequence test the persistence Java, and I should get some pretty good code testing coverage that's going on there. As we're thinking about the test cases that we think about, one of the things that I like to think about in this is not null for all member variables. And this is just a simple example that I put out there for me to think about just having my toolkit. I mean, how many times have you created a member variable and for whatever reason it wasn't set, it was left as null, and then you're left trying to figure that out, maybe in a production system. With your test case actually going through and doing that, you can definitely go through and validate and make sure that those things are set. The other one that I like to do that's also documented and coded up in this one is, do I put the name of the field in the actual object itself when I'm just exercising it, especially as I'm trying to cross the model and persistent objects together and do some mapping between them. You know, I just want to make sure that all my first name, last name, middle name, et cetera, are all set to first name, last name, and middle name as I'm just kind of exercising them and making sure that all the mappings are correct. That somewhere along the way, I did not just cross up things from first name to last name or last name to first name, et cetera. Certainly with things that are all named the same, that probably isn't nearly as likely, but you know what? We have these legacy old systems. We are integrating with things that have lived a long, fruitful life. It is not always clear as to what you might be crossing up, and having some test cases around just validating those things can make your life a lot easier. One of the things I love to do, especially for this, so my end users of my APIs do not necessarily need to get Swagger documentation or go look at the source code, is that, you know what, especially when stubbing out my objects, I just pass back out the model user in this case that I got passed in. This allows my developers to just figure out maybe what they might not be setting correctly, especially if first name isn't getting set. That capital N might throw JavaScript developers at times, or just, it's easy to just not know whether ID is capital I and capital D or capital I lowercase d, right? By just returning that back to them, we can let them know what's going on. And even after I flesh this out and map this into my service object, I generally feel like returning that model user back to the end user, back to the developer, maybe adding in a return code, adding in messages, adding in error statuses are all very powerful things to let my end user know what's going on with my API and to let them know that things are running as we would expect. The last thing I'm going to share with you, here's a link in this. I'll put this in a chat here in a second as we get our way towards any questions. I created a minimum lovable product scorecard. The BDCAF framework on the upper left is this idea that you want to deliver basics, delight, enlightenment, complete curations for your end user. You want to give them, my eyes can't see that, advantages, and you want to give them you want to allow them to be in flow, right? So BDCAF. And I basically just ask you, at what level of conversation are you having with that, your user team, your users, your teams, your stakeholders, et cetera, A through F, using the grading scale we use here in the US. Create an average at the end, and that could really change the way in which you think about, talk about, and deliver software. I am amazed as I think about projects I've worked on, products I've shipped, products I inhabit, how little of that BDCAF framework is actually used to think about this. This is a riff off of a class I took a year ago for my master's program as extended learning, extended education, something that could greatly change the way in which you are thinking about your software. So with that, I guess it's time for any questions and or thoughts. I'm going to put in the chat just some things in here. Yeah, so I'm going to try not to be too far off camera, but yeah, Valdemar, I will definitely share you the presentation. The presentation should be shareable there in the chat. Are there any other questions? And feel free to come off of mute if you have any questions along the way. And then that assessment, let me cut and paste that into the chat. There we go. There's the minimum lovable product assessment. Again, feel free to look at that, copy that for your own use, and share that amongst your organization. If there aren't any questions, then let's do a few more things. Let's connect on LinkedIn if you so chose. My Design for Developers website is out here at this link. And if you'd like to talk after the fact, I'm going to be out of town for a few days after this for a much needed vacation. But if you'd like to book yourself in on this with that last link, feel free to chat more about this. I love this intersection of software development, Java development, thinking about microservices. The day job is at Red Hat Quarkus. I think I'd be remiss if you are a Java developer and aren't at least nominally aware of Quarkus. You really are missing out. The Java examples I had in there were from Quarkus. I need to put some things together in a GitHub repo. I just didn't quite get that done before this talk. But if you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll definitely share that out there in the near future. So with that, there aren't any questions. There is the link to all those things I just put out there. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I also have a Facebook group if you want to go hang out there. Hopefully Facebook is up today and they updated their DNS settings more safely moving forward. So with that, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I guess we'll turn this back over to the moderator. Oh, there's one question. There we go. What's your opinion about naming methods? Yeah, that's a good one. And I'm going to cheat and go back to the one thing that I was thinking about that I sort of had there. Let me get there. Ooh, do I not have that here? No, I don't have that in front of me. So what I've been doing with my API user.java files is I generally name the methods kind of with the same name of what the action is. So if I have something like post user, like I have a post annotation on that object, I'm going to do something like post user and then pass that in there. It just, yeah, is adult person. So that's a question there that says, if the argument cannot be anything else than a person, e.g., right? So, could you come off mute or give me a little bit more color on that one? I'm not quite sure what you're asking there. Naming methods is adult person, right? So in Java, we definitely want to do is questions about, is the argument cannot be anything else than a person? Just not quite following what you're asking there, Kurt. I'm so sorry. But my thinking on that is I generally like to be very verbose with these methods as to what things are going on there. Use a tool like Saver would be within the standardization. Yeah, I think Swagger is a great tool to expose API endpoints. It allows you to allow end users to play with these APIs. The things that I'm thinking, or the thing that challenges me a little bit with Swagger is what's the order of operations that I need to think about how I might invoke these in sequence. And if I'm thinking about, yes, microservices probably are stateless. Yes, microservices probably don't really have state across different invocations. But if I think about a lot of APIs that I've been playing with lately, things like Stripe, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., they're going to have a notion of authorization that you need to do. And you're going to need to call the right APIs in the right order to get the right access and tokens based on that user accepting you into their ecosystem. And then you're going to call other methods that need to be brought along with that access you're granted in that first invocation. And right, if you, the challenge with Swagger to me as I look at it is it's just a sea of APIs that you have documented. How do I know the order in which I might do things along the way, right? Do I need to look up an end user by some way, shape, or form, save off the fact that I have a user ID that then I use to update information about that user with yet another endpoint, right? And it isn't always clear often with just Word docs how to do that. I'm not always clear that Swagger really does a great job of helping us with that. All right, and then the adult question came along there. Person is adult or person is adult person. Ooh, that's a really good question, Kurt. I am a very verbose developer. IDEs auto fill in, and I'm not too proud to admit I have had more than a few method names that go on for many nouns and verbs to explain what it is that they're doing. Because to me, if you've read the Mythical Man Month from our friends at IBM from when I think that was the late 60s, early 70s, all the cost in software is in the maintenance. It isn't in the time it took me to write it today. It's in the time it takes me a year from now to make a change to it to effectively do that quickly. And if you think about some of the tips and tricks I put in this around two-string, non-null values in test cases, naming conventions so everything looks alike, all of these things about making life easier for you as a software developer, for your future self that doesn't yet even know you're going to have the problem, but is trying to lay scaffolding, lay a grand foundation, if you will, to make the world a better person or a better place for both you, but also the people come after you to maintain those systems. That really is where all these different conventions that I've come about within this talk, both the SaaS-Ment items at the beginning, which are really geared towards your end users and how you deal with them and think about, and just getting you to think a little bit more about them, but also what will you as a software developer deliver to end users to make the world a better place for you and the people that come after you. With that, it doesn't seem like we have any other questions. Please feel free to reach out. Those links are out there. I look forward to hearing from you on LinkedIn if you want to chat there. And feel free to make a meeting in the next week or two if you'd like. I look forward to speaking to anyone that wants to talk. And I guess with that, I'll pass this back to the mods and we'll segue this thing on our way out. Thank you all so much for your time and attention today. Again, my name is Jim Tyrrell. I hang out at Red Hat and I help customers and people think about minimum lovable products. And I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.